Hello, my name's Wes McDermott, and in this video, we're going to take a look at how to use Substance Painter from an absolute beginner's perspective. So we're going to texture a very simple asset, and I'm going to cover all of the basic fundamentals on how to use Substance Painter. So we got a lot to cover, so let's get started. Now, before we jump right into Substance Painter, I want to take a look at the asset that we're going to be working with. And to do that, I'm going to use a new application called Substance 3D Viewer. This application's in beta. It's free to use. You can download it from the Creative Cloud desktop app. Now, if you're following along in the project files, there is a folder called Meshes. And within that folder, there is a file called Hardcase USDZ. I'm going to use this file. So let's just drag and drop and place that here into Viewer. And that's just going to open up the 3D model file so we can take a look at it. And here you can see that I'm going to be working with this phone case. Now, the main thing that I want to showcase here is that this 3D object has two materials assigned to it. So if I select this cover, you can see that if I come over here to this appearance, we do have this material called cover that's assigned to the cover of the mesh. Now, if we look at the actual hard case itself, and you can see it's made up of a couple different 3D parts. We've got 3 of them here. And each one of these 3D parts has the exact same material associated with it. So again, if I come over here and take a look at my appearance, there is a material called case, which again, like I said, is assigned to each one of these 3D parts. So once we get into Substance Painter and we start working with this 3D object, we will essentially be working with 2 materials. And as you'll see, each of these materials has its own layer stack. More to come on that in just a moment. Now, one last thing I want to showcase here is this particular 3D object is actually animated. So here in Viewer, if I just scrub the timeline, here you can see that there's some animation associated here with this 3D model. When importing this USDZ file into Painter, I can select a frame to work with. This is ideal because I can choose the first frame so I can see all of the mesh for texturing. So now I have Substance Painter open and we're ready to create our first project. So what I'm going to do is go to File and choose New, and this is going to bring open the New Project dialog. Now at the very top, you're going to see Template. Now with everything set at the default, you should see this ASM, which stands for Adobe Standard Material, PBR Metallic Roughness. If you don't, you can click the drop down and then just choose it from here. But again, we're going to go with the default PBR Metallic Roughness. Now the next thing that you need to do is choose a file, and that file is going to be the 3D model that you want to texture. So that's the phone case that we just was taking a look at. So I'm going to choose Select. And then here, if you're following along in the project files, in the Meshes folder, we have Hardcase USDZ. This is the file that we want to use. So with it selected, I'm going to click Open, and now that's set and ready to go. Now, I had mentioned before that I'm using this USDZ because I'm working with an animated file, and this particular format gives me some extra options. The thing that I'm most concerned about is this frame option. And with the frame set to 0, that is going to give me that first frame, which is the phone case completely folded open. That's ideal to work with because I can see the whole object while I'm in my texturing process. So that's what we're doing here. Make sure this is set to 0. Should be that way by default. Now, the next thing that we want to take a look at is this document resolution. And there's a couple options here. I'm going to choose this value of 2048, and I typically start at this value. This is a really great starting point because you get good quality, but it's also balanced with, speed and performance on your machine. So Substance Painter is what we call GPU bound, meaning that a lot of the computation's happening on a GPU. So the better the GPU on your system, the better performance you're going to get. Now in this particular case, I'm using a MacBook, and I'm using an M2 Max Pro, and it works pretty awesome with this resolution. And I can also increase this resolution as well, so I'm not stuck. Like for example, if I said, hey, I want to work at 2048, but then maybe later down the road, I really want to export maybe a 4K texture. I can do that. That's the beauty of working in Substance. We are working with non-destructive resolution independence. So again, more on that later in the course when we go to export, but for now, just know that I can simply switch this to 4K at any time. But performance-wise, I keep it at 2K. Now, everything else I'm going to keep at the default. We just want to make sure that we're not changing any of these advanced options. One thing I do want to just bring to your attention, if I scroll down, just make sure if you're following along in this class that this auto unwrap is not enabled. Now, just for your information, this auto unwrap is going to basically just do an auto unwrap of the 3D model. This is going to create what's called a UV map for me. So if you get a 3D object and you haven't created any UVs, Substance Painter can do that for you, and it's pretty awesome. I use it quite a bit. But in this case, we have a specific UV layout, which you'll see as soon as I open this particular project. But we have that UV layout. It's part of the 3D model. I created that myself in my own 3D program. But just want to make sure you don't have this enabled because it takes some time and it'll kind of throw you off if this is the first time you opened Substance Painter. Okay, so that's it. Just a few settings there. We're set. We're ready to go. Now I just need to click OK. Now, Substance Painter has opened the project, and right here in the center, we're seeing our viewport. So on the left side, I see a 3D model, and on the right side, I see a view that looks like a monster ripped open my 3D model and just flattened everything out. Well, this is what the UV coordinates are, and so if I zoom out here a little bit, if you're familiar with UVs, this is what the UV looks like for this particular asset. Now, I'm not really going to get in and cover UVs in this course. So I'm not really going to use this 2D view, but as I had mentioned earlier, if you need to have UVs created, Substance Painter can do that for you when you create your project. But for now, we're not really going to look at this 2D view. So here at the top of the UI, I have this button, and this is my 3D 2D button. And what I can do is just click on this, and I'm going to choose this option for 3D only, and that is just going to give me my 3D view. Okay, so first thing we're going to do is learn how to navigate this 3D view, because we're going to be doing that a lot. So in order to pivot or rotate around the 3D object, I can hold down the Alt or Option key and use my left mouse button, and I can just rotate and around the object like this. And wherever your mouse is, that is going to be the pivot point at which you rotate around. So for example, if I have my mouse here, I use the Alt or Option, left click, and now you can see I'm pivoting around that point. Now, if I want to pan the viewport, I just hold down the Alt or Option and use my middle mouse button, and now I can pan the view around. So we're going to use Alt or Option, left click, rotate, and then click middle mouse button, and we can pan. Now, the last thing we need to do is zoom in and out. So once more, Alt or Option, and then use my right mouse button, and then I can move the mouse up or down to kind of zoom in and out here. And so those are the three ways that I can really just navigate my 3D view. And like I said, we're going to do this a lot as we're working through our project. Now, here in the UI, you're going to see this section here called Texture Set List. And earlier in the video, when we first got started, I was talking about the materials that were assigned to the 3D object, and we had a case and a cover. Now, those materials, as I showed in Substance Viewer, are now available here to me inside of Substance Painter. However, Substance Painter calls it a texture set list. So we have case and cover. Now, the important thing to understand at this point in the game is that each one of these materials is going to have its own layer stack. So we're going to have 2 layer stacks, one for each material. And just to showcase this once more, you can see this is the case. If I toggle this visibility on and off, that is all of the 3D objects that have that case material assigned. Same thing here with the cover. And like I said, we're going to start working with the cover, so I'll select it. And this is the layer stack that is associated with this cover material. Since we're talking about this cover material and its layer stack, there is a fundamental thing to understand with the types of layers you create in Substance Painter. There are 2 types, a paintable layer and a fill layer. So with this cover, you'll see that the layer stack automatically has a layer that has this little paintbrush icon, and this is what's referred to as a paintable layer. It just means that you can paint directly on this layer. So for example, if I come over to where the cover is and I start to paint, I can now paint directly on this cover. Now, I can paint on any surface that has this cover applied. However, if I move my mouse over to an area of the 3D model that has the mesh applied to the case material, as you can see here, with the cover selected, notice I can't paint here. So in this instance, you can't paint across materials. Now, Painter does have a more advanced feature set called UDIM, which does allow you to paint across these texture sets. However, that is a more complex topic that's not covered in this course. So for now, just know that you have your material or texture set selected, you have a layer stack, and you can paint within that texture set. Now with the layer selected, I'll have my properties panel that gives me my little brush stroke, and I have a material preview. And then I have these little buttons, and these buttons allow me to make changes to things like the brush and the material. That's another thing to understand about Painter. Whenever you have a brush, you're going to have a material associated with it. So with the brush tab, you can see I can scroll down through here and I can change all kinds of things. So for example, here, let me just undo this stroke. And if I add some things like the size, jitter, and we'll say angle and position, you can see it's giving me a brush preview. And if I go into here and say like, let's do something like adjust the size, we'll make it a little bit smaller, and I go to paint, you can see I'm basically creating a different type of brush that I'm using. Now, if we come over here to the material tab, this is going to be the material that I set up. And you'll see that there's some buttons here for the channels. These channels are set based on the template that you use when you create the project. So if you recall at the beginning of the video, we used the template ASM, or Adobe Standard Material Metallic Roughness. So that's why we have color, rough, and metal channels. And if I want to change the color, I can just come over to the color. We'll click this swatch and I'll choose, like, say, this red. And now if I come over here and I start to paint, I'm now painting with a red color. Now Painter excels at not just painting color, but painting a full material. So let's just undo these strokes that I have here, and let's go to the color. Let's scroll down and let's take a look at this roughness. Now, if I move this slider towards black, which means smooth, here in my material preview, you can see I'm getting what looks like a glossy or reflective surface. And then if I take this metalness, this metal slider, and I pull it towards white, I'm telling the surface that, hey, this is a metal I want to create. And again, my material preview now looks like this metallic reflective sphere, kind of like a Christmas ornament. So if I come over here and I start to paint, now you can see that I'm getting, and I'll zoom in so you can really see it, I'm now starting to get this metallic looking surface as I paint. And that is what a paint layer is. I set a material, I have a paintbrush, and now I can start to paint with it. Now, if I want to create some different brushes or use a set of different brushes, kind of like you'd pick a brush in Photoshop, I can come over here to my Assets panel. This is a little Asset tab here, and I can click here on this brush. Now, there's a little filter here saying base material. I'm just going to close that out. And now I can see I've got all types of brushes here. So if I just grab a brush, and I'm just going to randomly pick one. Let's do this one here. You can see this is a concept brush, so we'll grab it. And now I have another brush that I can work with. And as I start to paint, I get a brush here. And as I grab another one, let's see, I don't know, this one here, you can see I get, again, another brush. I can use the Control or Command key with the right mouse button and drag left and right to change the brush size. I could also use the left and right bracket keys. So those are some quick shortcuts to be able to change the size of the brush. So why don't you take just a few moments here to just kind of play around with this paint layer. Come over here to the Assets panel, grab some different brushes, maybe play around with just a few of these settings here. Another thing that's pretty cool is I can even come over here to this height and increase this into a positive value. And then when I go to paint, this is actually going to look like a bit of a kind of a more of a 3D look to it. And again, I can just have fun by trying out these different brushes here. And if you want to try some of the, changing or tweaking some of the brushes, again, you can do that here with your size, flow, and so on and so forth. And you can just kind of have fun. Use the cover of this phone as kind of like a blank canvas and just take a little bit to get yourself familiar with picking different brushes and choosing different values here for your material. Okay, so I hope you had some fun playing around with some brushes and material colors. And so what you're seeing here, this is what we're going to be doing in the next step. So now that you see where we're going, let me show you how to get there. Now we're going to apply a material, a pre-made material, to this cover. Now over here in the assets, we have lots of materials that ship with Substance Painter, and you can start with any of these, but I want to show you how to use Substance 3D Assets, which is going to go out and grab from the huge collection of the Substance 3D Assets library. It's a super useful tool, and I use it a lot. So what I'm going to do here is in my search category, I'm going to grab a silicone material. So let me just type this in. I'll hit enter, and this is the one that I want to use here. So if I just left click on it, you can get some information on what this material is going to look like. Now, it's not the color that I want, but that's no problem. With Substance 3D Assets, the materials are parametric, which means I can change them after the fact. Super cool. All right, so we could download it here, or if I want to be quick about it, I could just click this quick download button. And so this is going to download. I've already done it, but you would see like a progress bar show up down here. So now if I jump over to my assets, it's going to automatically select it. So I can see I have this little blue outline here in my assets. This is the material, and this is what I want to use. So like I said, this is a pre-made material, and we want to assign this. So here's how we do it. I can just simply left click on the material, and I can drag and drop it, and you can see that this little wireframe selection view comes over the 3D model. And this is giving me like kind of like what I call a quick drop. So I could drop it right on the case, which is actually going to be, the cover, which is actually going to drop it on the cover material. Or if I mouse over into this section, you can see it's already highlighting it. So if I let go at this stage, it would drop the material into the case materials layer stack. But like I said, in my case, I want to apply it here. Now, another option is that instead of just dropping it on the model, since I already have the cover material selected, I can drag and drop it right here into the layer stack. So as I had shown you earlier, we have this kind of default paint layer. Here, I'm going to drag this and I'm going to hit above that paint layer, and I'll let go of my mouse, and now it drops the material down. And now I can see some color in my 3D view, and I have this new layer. This new layer is called a fill layer. This is that second type of material, or second type of layer that I had mentioned earlier before we got deep into the brush material settings here. So we have our paintable layer, and now we have this new material called a fill layer. And essentially what it does is it takes our material channels and just fills them with information, whether it be like a uniform color or some kind of data or a texture map. Just as long as it makes a material, that's all we really care about. So now I have this fill layer. Now, what's interesting about this is I can start to work with this. Like I said, this is a procedural material in the sense that I can change parameters. So first things first, if I come over here to my properties, you can see there's a couple options. We have this fill properties, which handles things like projection and tiling. So for example, when you apply a material, you need to let Substance Painter know how you want that material projected onto the 3D model. And by default, it starts with this mode here called UV projection. Now, we talked a little bit about UVs when we first started the course. So again, I'm going to jump up here to the top of my toolbar, my little drop down. I'm going to temporarily switch this to the 3D 2D view. And then if we zoom out, you can see this is that UV layout that this model had. So in this case, what's happening with the projection set to UV is I have presented Painter. I said, hey, I have this material. And Painter's like, oh, okay, I have this material. I'd like to apply it based on these UVs. So we could do that. Another option, let me quickly set that back to 3D view, would be to use this option here called triplanar. So most of the time, you're either going to use one of two things, UV or triplanar. There's lots of other options. I don't even cover them in this course, but like I said, the two main ones are going to use UV and triplanar. So if I drop here into triplanar, what this does, and you can see if I zoom out, we have this manipulator with this box. And triplanar takes the material and it projects it onto the 3D surface across the X, Y, and Z axes. So basically projects it in 3D space. And then what's interesting is I can grab this little manipulator and you can see I can move this around to change the perspective. Now, the difference is this. I would use triplanar when I want to project a 3D object onto a surface and not have to worry about any seams. So in something like this, where we've got kind of more of a rectangle kind of cube, it works perfect. If I had something like a complete round sphere, then it might give a little bit of issue. You'd see some blending around where the material is trying to blend itself. So in stuff like this, it works really well. However, if I jump over to my UVs, this also works really well too. And the reason it does is because if I look at my 2D view, and I'm the one who did the unwrap, so I did it specifically, so that if I were to map something on the front or back of this cover, I could do so very easily. So in this particular case of this 3D model, it doesn't really matter. And that's kind of one of the interesting topics about 3D is Sometimes you don't know what you're going to get with 3D models, and sometimes the UVs are not going to be in a good spot. They're going to be distorted or not look very well, and it might make the textures look kind of weird on the surface. And if that happens, what I usually do in that scenario is I just quickly pop this down into triplanar, and like I said, most of the time that's going to, fix the situation. And of course, you have this little manipulator, but at the top of my toolbar here, I have some transform tools. So you'll see that I have like translate, rotate, and scale. So just to show you that really quickly, if I was in triplanar mode, I could grab this rotation tool, grab a 3D axis like the Y axis, and I could rotate this guy. And now let's say if I want this material grain to kind of follow this direction, I can just quickly do that. And you can see I'm kind of using this very visual, what you see is what you get kind of approach to texturing. So that's one way to work with triplanar. Let's pop this back over here to our UV, and I could do the same thing. So again, if I look at this 2D view, and I have this manipulator, I could move this guy around, and you can see how the projection is controlling, again, like I said, how this material is showing up on the 3D surface. And if I move my mouse here outside of the little manipulator, I get these two little arc arrows, and if I just rotate, I could do the same thing. I'm holding down Shift, do a little snap, and now this is aligning here as well. So I'm kind of jumping into this, a little bit of a deep dive, just so you can kind of understand how this is. Overall, let's say if I just go back and undo this to what we had at default, let's close this back here to our 3D view. This is what we had by default. This is going to work pretty well. Now, if I look at the scale of things, and again, this is just kind of how 3D is, like the material is designed so that, hey, it's seamless, meaning that it can repeat across the surface. And, sometimes the 3D object size might be different than the material size. And what do you do there? Well, there's some specific scenarios where you can use something called physical size, which could be really cool. And again, a little bit of a complex topic. We won't cover it here. But in my case, I just want to be visual and just get things working so we can, it's a beginner level course. Let's just get something that looks pretty cool quick. We're going to leave it at UV. And here you'll see the section here for tiling. If I just come over here and I set this to, I'm just going to guess and say 4, and we'll hit enter. There you go. I'm repeating that across the surface. Now it looks a little bit better, more fine detail, and now I have something more in line of what I wanted to work with. Perfect. Now, also, like I said, this is a procedural material, so I can do some neat things here with some of the parameters. Like this particular material has some settings for like the grain. So if we look at this, I can see there's some grain here on this surface. Now, I can take this grain intensity, so just for me, my take on it is this is a little too intense. So I'm just going to drag this slider and push it down here closer to 0, and look at that. If I zoom in really close, I am seeing some detail here, but it's not, super in my face, too intense. And maybe it's too mellow right now, so let's just intensify it a little bit. But this is what's cool about Painter, is I can just take a visual kind of visual guess or tour of what I want to do with this material and just dial things up and down and make changes as I go. So now we have our color, and if I click this color, it grabs this color picker, and I can choose a color, which is pretty good. But Painter has this really neat feature with the color picker. So of course I could pick anywhere in the document, like if I wanted to pick maybe this yellow, I could do that. Don't want that, so I'm going to undo it. But what's cool about Painter that I really like about the picker is that you can use this color picker and pick outside of the application. So for example, I have a web page open and I'm using Adobe Color, and I've created this little swatch here that I want to use. Now, if you want to have access to this, I've saved this in color themes. There's a color themes folder in the project files as a JPEG, so you can have access to these hexadecimal numbers. So if I wanted to, of course you could copy the value. I could come over here to the pick, and I could paste it into here, or this is what I use all the time. Like I said, I love this feature, is I could grab here the color pick, and I can move outside of the application and then choose whatever value I want. So in this case, I want to go with this orange. I'm just going to left click here, and boom, you can see that it updates. Okay, so the next thing that we want to talk about is we have our material, but what really helps us to see our material is the lighting here that we have in our viewport. So if I come over here to this bar, which is the display settings, we're going to open this up, and you'll see there's a section here in this window for environment map. Now, if I take this opacity, let me just increase this all the way to 100. Let's take this blur down. You can see there's this sphere mapped around the scene, and there is a texture map map to it. And this texture map is what's called a high dynamic range image. And all of the lighting in Substance Painter is coming from this HDR image. Now, if I want to change the lighting direction, what I need to do is change this environment rotation. So if I move the slider, as I start to rotate the environment, you can see that the lighting is changing. Now, the way you're going to work with this every time is, let's just take this opacity, let's set it back to 0, we'll close this out, and I'm going to use a keyboard shortcut. So if I hold down the Shift key and use my right mouse button and I move left to right, you can see I'm now rotating that environment and thus changing the lighting direction. So if I zoom in here on the cover and then I move my light around, now these little details I was talking about, they start to show up as the lighting direction changes. So usually you'll do a tweak to your material, you'll hit Shift, right mouse button, move it around, get a good feel for how the lighting is interacting with the surface, or more accurately said, how the material is interacting with the light. And that'll help you gauge things like, what do I set for this intensity value? You know what, I will just drop that grain intensity down a little bit. Now, another tip for working with the environment light. So we have this cover and we want to maybe look at the other side. So right now it's flipped open. We need to use our navigation, our viewport. Let's flip around to the other side. However, it looks really dark. We're looking underneath the device and it looks really dark. And this is something you'll do a lot. You're kind of pivoting and moving around the 3D object. And this is super annoying because of how dark it is. Well, what you can do is come over here to your display settings once again, and there's an option here for right underneath the rotation called Environment Alignment. And it's set to World by default, but what I usually do, or almost always do, is I just keep this set to Camera. And what this means now, if we just go back and I adjust my light, the environment is going to align to the camera. So if I'm here at the top, let's go ahead and set my light so that I can really see what I'm doing. And I flip around to the back side, look, it's aligned to the camera. So no matter which way I rotate, I'm gonna be able to see my details with the proper lighting angle. And this is what you're gonna work with most of the time. Okay, one last thing. If we jump over here to display, when we're talking about our environment map, we can actually change this as well. So if I click this button, this mini window pops up and I have lots of different options here. So for example, if I change the environment map here, let's do a couple of these. Let's do cave, entry, forest. You're gonna get different looks. So again, I can move my lighting around. We'll click this button. Let's try something like this bus garage. Again, you're just gonna get different looks. So I'm gonna set this back to this panorama, which is the default setting so that we're all on the same page. You could also, if you wanted to, enable shadows, and this is going to appear or render some shadows in the scene. You might want to toggle this on and off every now and then, but mostly I really don't use this because as you're working, it's just kind of flickering and getting in the way. So I typically just turn this off here. All right, so now we have everything set up. Let's take a look at the next thing we're going to do, which is add a metal material here for this hinge. So we're going to start by coming over to our layer stack, and we're going to click this button, which is going to create a new fill layer for us. So I'll click the button, and you can see I now have a new fill layer. And if I double click, I can name the layer. So here I'm just going to call this metal hinge. Okay, so now I have a new layer. So we've already discussed how this fill layer fills the channels with uniform color values. And so what we want to do is, in this case, make our own metal material from scratch instead of relying on one of these base materials that we already have in our assets folder. So first things first, what I need to do is set my color. So here again, I'm going to grab my color picker, and this time I'm going to come over here to, I have Adobe Color open, and I'm going to use that same orange swatch. So we'll select that. Don't forget, you could also just copy and paste the hex color or change the colors manually. Okay, so now we've set our color. And the next thing I'm going to do is set this roughness value down to be pretty low. We want this to be reflective, and we need to set this as a metal material. So I need to take this metal slider, and I'll move it from black all the way here to white, and this makes a metal material. Now, what you'll notice is that, well, while we do get a metal material, we are also still seeing all of the textural detail that is in the smooth, opaque silicone material that's underneath. And so the layer stack works by processing layers from the bottom up. And one of the things that can be confusing, especially when you're first getting into Painter, is, hey, this layer is on top. Why am I seeing some of the values from the material below it? Shouldn't it overwrite? Well, the answer to that question is that some of the channels, and we'll say height and normal specifically, are trying to blend together, and it's set that way by default. And that's why you have this little drop down here at the top of the layer stack. This here is called the view mode, and I can set this to different channels. Now, because Substance Painter works across multiple channels, it's just a UI option to be able to say, hey, even though this layer represents multiple channels, all the ones that you see here, I want to pull out and work with some blending modes for a specific channel. So that's why here I might choose something like the height channel. So I'm using the view mode to select height, and this is going to change my settings here for the blending modes and the layer opacity. And you'll notice that it's set to linear dodge by default, which means it's just going to combine with the data below it. That's exactly what's going on here in this situation. So for example, if I now come over to the blending mode, I'm going to set this to normal, you can see that that fixes the issue. We have said that, hey, we want to have just normal, meaning no blending. The height is enabled on this channel, and the height is enabled on the channel below it. Notice that the normal channel is not enabled. Normal is like a bump channel, basically, kind of similar to height. But in this case, all I need to do is just override that height information using the view mode. Now, you can leave it at height. Usually, I just set this back to color, just out of habit. It doesn't matter. Like I said, just know that these view modes is only allowing you to change or select the blending mode and the layer opacity for a given channel. So like I said, I'll just keep this back to base color. Okay, so now we have this metal hinge material overriding this silicone material that we added previously. What we need to do at this stage is start to mask. So just like we would add a layer mask in Photoshop, we need to do that here in Substance Painter. So to do that, we're going to jump back over here to the layer stack, and I have this button here, which is going to allow me to add a mask. And we have different types of masks that we can add. Typically, I start with a black mask. So we're going to create a black mask that creates a layer mask, and you'll notice that black meaning completely transparent, so we see through to the layer below it. And that's precisely what we're getting here in our viewport. We no longer see the metal because we've basically set the whole thing to be black. We're seeing right through to this silicone material that's underneath of it. Now, with this layer selected, one of the things I'm going to do is jump back over here to my layer stack, and I'm going to grab this little magic wand tool. This is how we can add effects. And if we click this, there's lots of these effects. We can add like a special generator, like a filter to create a mask for us. We can add a fill. We can do a paint. This is what I want to do. I want to add a paint. So now we'll add this paint effect into here. And what I can do is once I've added this paint to my mask layer, I now have a paintbrush. So just as we discussed before, we can jump over here to our paint properties, and we can choose things like our brush size, spacing, flow, jitter, all these things. Typically for a mask, I'm going to use just a default brush like this. Now, there's a couple other things that we can do. I mentioned earlier that if you hold down the Command or Control key and move the mouse button left or right, that will increase or decrease the size. Notice that with this default brush, there's this nice fall off. Now, if I want to change that, I could come over here to the brush properties and change basically the hardness of the brush. And you're going to find that setting here on the alpha. So we have this hardness of the brush. So I'm going to hold down the Command or Alt button and then use my right mouse button and then move the mouse up or down, and this is going to control that hardness. It's another shortcut that I can use just to quickly control the hardness of the brush. So I don't want it to be like super soft fall up, but I don't want it to be very, very crisp and hard on the edges. So just, slight little feather. That's usually how I'll work for this. So again, Command or Control, right mouse button left to right is going to zoom or scale down my brush. I could also use my left and right bracket keys if I need to as well. And so here I could go in and I could start to paint with this brush, and I'm painting with a value of white. So where is this coming from? Well, I mentioned earlier that every time you have a brush, there's a material associated with it. And that actually holds true even when you're working with a mask. So if we look at the paint, we have, again, our brush settings, we have an alpha, and then we're going to skip this stencil. We're not going to cover that in this course. But if we come over to this last option, this is a grayscale gradient. So because we're working in a mask, which is black and white and kind of grayscale values, We don't have a material per se in that there's base color, metal, rough. We don't have that. But what we do have is a value, and that's, I guess it's kind of like a material, just black and white. And so you can see that as if I'm painting a black transparent mask with white, that allows me to mask the material. So if I wanted to come in here and paint like this, I could do that. Now, you can see that, well, my paint job is not too great. It's kind of bleeding over into the cover. So what could I do? I could grab the slider, let's set it to black, and now I could go in here and try to paint and really get down in this edge. And I can use a keyboard shortcut of X on the keyboard. This toggles between white and black, kind of a great way to mask. Another really cool shortcut, especially if you have like a hard edge like this, is you can, let's set this, we'll keep this at black. We'll click once, hold down the shift key, and then now I'm going to have this like what's called a straight line tool that's part of the brush. And this will allow me to create just a straight edge. So now if I click once more, that could be a good way to mask this out. But again, if I zoom in close, it's not perfect. I could go back and forth on this all day long. And you can say, oh no, look, I've got a little gap here. Hit X to invert. Let's go back and try to fill that in. So you could do this if you wanted to. Like I said, one thing you'll learn with Substance Painter is there's so many different ways to work. So I'm not going to go this route. Here's what I'm going to do. We're going to kill that paint effect. Let's go and add another paint effect. And this time over here on my toolbar, so this is your toolbar. We've been using the brush tool. We have an eraser. We have a pen tool. There's lots of options here. But I'm going to use this one, which is called a polygon fill tool. This is like the fill object in Photoshop. So when I select this with my paint effect, we get a couple fill modes. So you have what's called triangles, these little faces that you see here in the wireframe view. You have faces, you have object, and then you have UV, which is basically UV shells. We're not really messing too much with UVs in this course, so we're not even going to worry about that. What we're going to use is just this polygon fill object mode. And so it's set to white, and then now, because this geometry, if I zoom in really close, you can see this geometry is actually a separated mesh part. What I can do now is just click. So I'll come into here and I'll click on this part, and there you go. I get a perfect mask based on the geometry. I'm going to go back to the brush, and there we go. So I didn't have to spend a lot of time painting. I've got that perfect mask in place. If we want to see what the mask looks like, if I hold down the Alt or Option key here and I just click, and I clicked on the mask itself, this allows me to view what I just created. So with this metal hinge layer, we have this mask, which is now showcasing white is what the metal is, and everything that's black is going to show the layers underneath of it. If I want to get back, I can click this icon or click or press M on the keyboard to take me to material mode. And so there we go. We can now see that is how we can apply a fill layer to create our own custom material, and we can use layer masking so we can start to get a little bit more sophisticated in how we work with our materials by blending multiple layers on top of each other in this layer stack. So now let's start looking at texturing the actual phone case itself. And since I like this silicone material, I could simply just copy and paste it. So I can, just use normal copy and paste, Command C, Control C to copy it, or right click here and you can choose to, copy layers. So we'll do that. And then here I'm going to select the case, which is the texture set. Now, as I said earlier, now you can really see this come into play where these materials have, these materials will have their own texture set. So with this case selected, I'll hit Command V or Control V. This is going to paste in, and now I have this new material. So what I want to do, of course, you probably already guessed it, I want to change the color. So once again, I'm going to grab my color picker, choose this color value from my color theme, and I'm good to go. All right, so now that we have our material and our color, I want to show something here. So I'm going to zoom in on this area, and if you take a really close look, you can see that, well, we get a little bit of distortion here in the detail that's coming from this material. And in this particular case, it really comes down to that projection mode. So again, with my layer selected, and if I look at the properties, I'm on the Fill tab, and there's projection. Like I said, it's based on UV by default. And in this particular case, the way the UVs are laid out, it's causing a little bit of this issue. Now, a way to fix that pretty quickly would be to, again, set it to triplanar. We talked about this a little bit earlier. Like I said, mainly UV UV and triplanar, the two options I'm using. But if I just set this to triplanar, you can see that it pretty much fixes it. So it looks pretty good now. Now, as I said earlier, you have this like little manipulator here that's trying to cover the whole object. And if I wanted to make any change to this, let's say on the Z axis, I could just grab the manipulator on the Z axis handle, it's this blue handle, and just move it. And you can see I can just kind of move this texture around. Don't really need to do it in this particular case, but what I'm going to do is just take the projection box and just kind of align it over the case section here. And this is the result that I'm getting. So you can see it looks a lot better. So just once more, this is what we had under UV, and you're getting some of this distortion here. And then here is what we get with triplanar. Looks a lot cleaner. Okay, so now I would like to have a different color here on this right side of the case. So let's do that. We can come over here to our layer stack and we can duplicate. I'm just going to right click here on the layer and choose duplicate layer. And now I need to change the color. So let's come over here to the material tab, and then we have that silicon color. So now I can just grab my color picker, and since I already have this value over here on the case, I can just simply select and pick from this case color. So we'll do that, and you can see that that sets the color. Another option that you have, if I open up here the color picker, you can see that we can also create swatches. So for example, let's say that I had a color that I wanted to work with, and I wanted to save this. I can just click this plus button, and that'll create a swatch for me. So in my case, I did create a swatch for this orange value, which I want to use. So I can just click this button, and that applies the color. So now we need to mask this corner of the case, and we could do that using a layer mask as I shown previously. So with the layer selected, we can come down and create another mask. However, there's another way to create masks, and that's called using a geometry mask. So here on the layer, if we take a look, you'll notice that we have this square with a dashed line. So I can select this thumbnail, and that takes me into the geometry mask. And depending on how the model was created, you may see some mesh parts. Now, in the particular creation of this model in the 3D program, these mesh parts are separated onto different layers, and every 3D program kind of handles that differently. So again, like I said, it really depends on how the model was created. But in this case, I created it, so I knew that, I would love to be able to select based on these different mesh parts. So what I can do is just simply click in the viewport to just unassign or mask various mesh parts. I could also just click here on these little check boxes. Another option is that I can use my left mouse button and I can select mesh parts. And if I want to invert this selection really quickly, I can use the Alt or Command key and let go of my mouse, and that will quickly select just this part. So now you can see here in the UI up here in the corner, we now have this geometry mask, which is showing 1, meaning that one mesh part is being used to create this mask for this layer. And this is, like I said, a geometry mask. So to get out of this mode, I just simply need to come over here to the material icon and just click on it once. And now I've masked based on the geometry information that's in the 3D model. Okay, so now I'm going to rotate around to the back side of the case. We're going to add some additional details. Now, real quick, if you orbit around the back and everything looks really dark, if you recall earlier, we would come over to our display settings and again, just make sure this environment alignment is set to camera. That way the lighting is being adjusted from this camera perspective. Okay, so now we're ready to add some details here to the back of the phone case. So this is the next texture detail that we're going to create here in Substance Painter. We're going to add these little circles that are going to represent this grip texture for the back of the phone case. All right, so let's jump in and take a look at how this works. So the first thing we want to do is we're going to jump over here to our Assets tab, and you'll see at the top we have these buttons which act like filters for different types of content. Now, if you don't see these buttons, it could be that the tab is just shortened, so it kind of cuts off everything, and you have this main filter button, and you could access the buttons through this little drop down, or if this is the scenario you find yourself in, just don't worry, you can just click and drag, and we'll extend this tab, and now I have my buttons. So what we want to do is we want to come over here to this option, which is the texture filter. So I'll click on this, and this is going to filter out all of the different texture maps that ship with Substance Painter that can help us in our texturing process. Now, a specific texture that I'm looking for is called circles. So I'm going to do a search here for circles, and you can see that it filters out, and I have this circles map. This is what I want to use. Now, there are several ways to apply this texture to a 3D surface. First thing I could do is I could take this and I could drag and drop and I could place it right here in the layer stack. Now, as soon as I let go of my mouse, it asks me, hey, what do you want to do with this? Do you want to take this and place it into the base color? Do you want this to be roughness information? Or do you want it to be a layer mask? And so if I say layer mask, you can see that what this does is it creates that fill layer that we've been working with. It adds a layer mask already, a black mask. Then it adds a fill, which is this effect here, a fill effect. It adds that automatically. And then if we take a look here in the properties, the grayscale input, and this is just a button itself. If I click this, you can see that in this resources, I could have searched for circles and I could click and drag and select or click to apply the circles right here to this grayscale switch or button. And so that is one way that we could do this. Now, the issue with this is that we're on UV projection. Like you've said, I could change this to a couple different things. Like I could switch it to, let's say, our triplanar projection. I could try some different options, but then I need to scale and reposition and do all kinds of stuff here. So I'm going to show you another option that I feel like is a little bit faster because it just involves a little less clicking. So let me show you that. We're going to come over to this layer for now. I'm just going to delete it. Let's go back here to the library. Now this time, I'm going to left click and drag. And as you can see here, I can actually drag this texture map onto any of the surfaces. Like I could drag it to the cover material, or in my case, I want to keep it on the case, so we'll say case material. Now, when I let go of my mouse button here, you can see that the same window appears. Hey, what do you want to do with this? Do you want it to be mask, color, metallic, roughness? What is this? And I can say, hey, you know what, Substance Painter, I want to create a layer mask for this guy as well. So I'll do this. Now the difference being, once again, if we look over here in our layer stack, we have our fill layer, we have our black mask, we have our fill effect, and again, if we look at the properties, we have that the image is already placed in the properties. But what's different here? If we look at the properties for the fill, you can see there is a projection mode called warp projection. So now we're just using a different effect altogether, a different projection mode. And this gives me a little widget or a tool, and this tool can be found up here at the top of the toolbar. You can see it's called the Surface tool. And this is a little handy tool. It allows me, if I just click and drag, I could drag this little material, or this decal, we'll call it, anywhere I want on this surface. This is great if I were adding something like maybe a label to something. This is a great way to work. You can just drag it on the surface, choose mask or color, whatever channel, it automatically selects the Surface tool, and you could set this up. Now, as I said, you could go through and manually set all this up. It's just a matter of changing the projection mode. But like I said, it's going to save us a couple clicks. All right, so we have this here, but now I want to basically transform, rotate, and scale this into position. So in order to do that, we can come up to the top of this toolbar for our 3D view, and we have a couple handy tools. The Translate tool, which is good for moving and translating this texture. We have the Rotate tools, we can rotate things. And then here we have the Scale tool. So what I'm going to do is I use the Surface tool to slide this across the surface, but now I can come over here and I can click on the Scale tool. And the Scale tool has a keyboard shortcut of R. So it's R on the keyboard activates the Scale tool. And you have a couple axes. So I could scale on the X, I could scale on the Y, or if I want to scale uniform, both X and Y, I could just grab hold of this center cube, click and drag, and that scales the entire texture up. So now what I want to do is rotate it. So here we'll grab the Rotate tool. This is going to be the keyboard shortcut E on the keyboard. And now I have my 3 axes, and I want to use this Z or Z axis, which is the blue circle. So click and drag, and now I can rotate that into position. And finally, I would grab my Position tool. And here I can grab my X handle, my Y axis, and just reposition it. In practical application, you're going to move through these really quick. So for example, I'm going to hit R to scale this guy up. I could hit move by hitting the W key on the keyboard. So W is move and reposition this guy. So let me scale this guy up. It's been rotated, and there we go. I'm in place. Now, I have some circles, but I have a couple problems here. The first problem is that I just want the circles to appear on the back of the case, not on the sides. And we have this weird kind of like smearing issue that's happening here. Also, if we flip around, this texture is being projected all the way through the space. So let's take a look at this projection issue to start. It's super easy to fix. We come over here to the circles, fill layer is selected. Now on the the properties for the fill tab, so I have that tab selected, there is an option called projection depth. And I can just decrease this, and you'll notice that as I do so, you have this little green arrow that's indicating the length of projection. So as I decrease this projection, notice how the texture is no longer, here, watch, if I zoom in really close, look at this. If I move the projection depth, you can see that I'm starting to just, move it off the surface. And so now I've moved it just a bit. If we flip around to the backside, perfect, that's fixed. However, I now have a little bit of issue here with this texture still appearing on the sides of the case, which I don't want. So what you would do in a scenario like this is, well, I could try to position, scale, and move it around to try to fix it. But in this case, I'm just going to add another mask. And this is something that's super powerful about Substance Painter. We can add multiple layers to build up a complex mask. So let's do that. I have the mask selected. I'm going to come over here to Add Effect. And now I'm just going to add a paint effect. So of course I could go into here, as we've already seen. I could grab here this fill tool. We're going to set it to black. And then I could come in here and try to erase this out. I could do this. Totally not cool. I don't like doing it. It's a pain. That's not what I want to do. Let's do a quicker way. So what I would do in this scenario is I would jump over here to my toolbar, and I'm going to grab this tool called the Polygon Fill. We've used it already. The mode is set to the object mode, this little cube, and it's set to black. And now all I need to do is just click, and that completely will mask the object that I clicked on. And now we'll click on this side, click, perfect, all done. And then I'll just click my brush to kind of go out of that wireframe mode. And now I have the circles applied. They're too large, but we'll fix that in a minute. They're no longer showing up on the sides of the case, and they're not showing up through the back. Perfect. Okay, so, and now for this mask, you can see we have 2 layers to build up a complex mask. What's kind of cool about this, though, is each of these little mask layers, they have their own blending modes. So I could do some cool blending mode stuff to make the mask kind of blend in more complex ways if I want to. I also have a layer opacity that I could use as well if need be. In this case, we don't need that. 2 layers gets us where we want to go. All right, so let's now look at the scale of these circles. So a way to fix that would be to go to Circles. Now, because we're using this warp projection, if I were to go to the fill and adjust the tiling, watch what happens. It does this. Okay, not what we want. No good. However, because this is a procedural texture, you can see this tab just quickly takes me to the appropriate sections here in this panel. So if we come over here to this texture, this guy has a tile, which is perfect. So I could actually adjust this slider, and I can just repeat the procedural map. Awesome. Now it goes to 16, but you can actually go further than that. So if I just come into here, that's something you can do in Substance Painter. You can enter values. So I'm going to enter a value of 24. And that is giving me the scale of these little circles that I want to work with. Now, like I said, this is also a procedural texture, so we can do some more stuff with it. For example, this balance slider, I'm going to decrease this balance slider, and it starts to make the circles, or the gap between the circles, a little bit more visible. But now they're too soft. And then I can take this little contrast and increase that. So we'll increase contrast. And now I get something that looks a little bit more like this. So for this little grip texture for the back of the case, this is what I want to work with. And like I said, I can also just play around with it. It's all completely non-destructive. Actually, I'm going to increase the slider just a little bit. All right, perfect. So that gets my texture in place. Now, the last part of this is going to be pretty simple. We want to just make some adjustments to the material channels themselves. So what I'll do now is just come over here to the material. So I click on the material swatch. You can see I'm on the material tab, and we have all these materials, or excuse me, channels, and I could start to, I could color these if I wanted to. Like if I wanted these to be red, we could do all that kind of stuff, but I definitely don't. In this case, I just want to have a little bit of a bump look to this. So what I can do is just start to disable channels, like for example, my color and my roughness and my metal and this normal. We're going to take all that off. And instead, what I'm going to have is just this height information. Now, we can't see anything, so it's at 0, but watch this. If I start to increase this slider towards the right, which is going to be positive, we're going to start to create this little bit of a bump effect here. And that's precisely the look that I was going for. I just want to have this appearance of this kind of textured grip. And that's what this height information is doing. Just as a little technical information, what's happening right now is we're not displacing the geometry. You could do that inside of Substance Painter, but that's an advanced topic. But what this is doing is it's creating what's called a normal map for me, which is this normal channel. And we don't need it on this particular material because Substance Painter can convert this normal in the shader, which is happening up here in the shader level. Again, a little technical, just telling you just so you know what's happening behind the scenes. Long story short, Substance Painter is creating the map that I need to make this thing look like a bump texture. Okay, so it might be a little intense, so I'm just going to back it off slightly. I love that everything you're doing here is very much kind of what you see is what you get. And that's it. That's the effect that we created. So we've added the circles. We've applied it as a layer mask, as you can see here. We masked it, we tiled it, and then we came over to the material itself and we turned off all the channels except for height and then gave it a little bit of a positive value to get this bump texture. The last thing we're going to do for our texture is I'm going to add this logo that you see here. And so this is the final result of what we're about to create. So now let's jump in and go through this step by step. So if you're following along, you'll see that I have the project files open, and inside the project files, there's a folder for Illustrator, and inside that folder, I have an actual Illustrator file. And I can drag and drop any file. Here I'm using an Illustrator, but it could be a JPEG, a PNG, like I said, any file resource. You can just drag and drop that from your desktop or wherever on your computer and bring that right into your Substance Painter project. So for example, if I left click and drag this Illustrator file and I bring it here into my Substance Painter project, just as I had shown previously, it's already highlighting the mesh part. So here's the case. If I wanted to put this on the cover, I could do so. And Substance Painter uses this drag and drop method to just quickly import a resource into the project. And you can drag this pretty much anywhere. So for example, this is the 3D model. I could place it over here into the layer stack. I could add it to a layer mask. I can even place it on one of these buttons here, like this is the height channel. Like I said, you can just drag and drop any resource and it'll automatically import. However, in this case, we're just going to place this logo right here onto the back of the phone case. So I'll let go of my mouse, and you can see that just as I'd shown previously, we now have this texture mapped to the back of the phone case. Now, here in the layer stack, you can see that it's created a fill layer. So we'll just double click, and I'm going to call this logo so we can rename these layers. And if we look at the properties, the projection type, again, is set to warp projection, just as we went through previously. Okay, so now, I need to do some transformation here. So let's grab, let's say, our scale, and let's scale this up a little bit. I'm going to jump over to my rotation and just realign this, and let's just see how we look with the move tool. So we're just going to translate this over, and that looks pretty good. So we'll go with something like that. Could be a little large. Let's just scale it down slightly. There we go. Okay, so now in this case, I'm showcasing how this Illustrator file works. So if we come over here to our properties and I go to the material, you can see that this particular type of file is being set as a material mode. It's using graphic to material. If this was just a standard like PNG or JPEG, it would just be applied to one of the channels, whichever one that you chose. But in my case, like I'd shown previously, that little pop-up appears and you can choose, do you want this to be a mask, base color, height, and so on and so forth. We didn't get that this time, like I said, because we're using the graphic to material. And to kind of showcase what I mean there, if we go down to our properties or our parameters, you can see there's a little material section. And this allows me to have this particular graphic drive certain parameters for the surface material, such as I can increase my roughness value here. I can use metallic. I can set height information and so on and so forth. Now, the way this graphic was created is just a black and white image, so it's typically designed to be used as a mask, so we don't really have any color information, and that's okay. I'm kind of using it as this standard fill in this particular case because you'll see what I'm going to do in a moment. We're just going to use height information, but if I wanted to use this as a mask, like I said, I could have simply created a fill layer and then dragged in this Illustrator file and placed it right over top of the mask input. Just another way to work. All right, so let's get to what we actually want to do. There's a couple cool things about working with the Illustrator file. Two things that are interesting to look at. First, if we look at the outline, we can actually stroke this graphic. So under the hood, because I'm using this Illustrator file, Substance Painter retains all the vector information. That means that as I change resolution, we'll kind of talk about that at the very end once we get to exporting, but if I change resolution under the hood, Substance Painter is able to scale this vector graphic up before it rasterizes it into a bitmap. So pretty awesome to be able to have kind of that non-destructive nature. And as you can see, it knows what the vector data is so that we can stroke, outline, so on and so forth. Don't want to do it in this case, but it's there if you need it. Now, the next thing that you can do that's kind of interesting, if we drop down to this file type specifics, you can see that there's artboards associated with this particular Illustrator file, and that can be really interesting if you're working with decals or stickers or something like that for your asset. So in this drop down, I can see that this has 3 different artboards within it, and it's pretty cool that I'm able to go through and just access these artboards, as you can see here. So here's the actual Illustrator file, and to just illustrate the point, you can see that here I have the 3 different artboards with different graphics, and like I said, we can easily choose between what artboard we want to be working with inside of Substance Painter. Gives you some flexibility and the ways that you're working with your different textures within different projects. Now, in this case, I just want to work with the height information. So I'm going to jump back over here to this material, and I'm going to take the height slider and I'm going to drag it all the way here towards 0 or black, and that is going to give this effect of the logo kind of pushing down into the surface. Now, I don't want this color information, so what I can do is just come up here to the top of the material tab, and you can see that I have the color, all these different channels like color, height, roughness, metal. These are all enabled. So I can turn them off individually, but a quick trick is that you can hold down the Alt or Option and then just left click on a channel, and that will deactivate all the other ones. And so now you can see that we start to get this logo effect, and it is pushing down to the surface, but we're starting to get this blending between the circles, the height information from the circles, and the height information that I just set right here in for this particular logo. Okay, so we kind of covered this a little bit earlier, and we're going to use our view mode here to change a blending mode. So what's happening, as I said earlier, is that Substance Painter, it looks at the layer stack. Things are processing from the bottom up, and it's constantly trying to blend information on the height and the normal channels. And a lot of times, like I was saying, that's what you want. However, this is a case where we don't want that. So what I can do is use our little view mode dropdown. And like I said, by default, it's set here to base color. And because different layers, like for example, a fill layer contains multiple channel information, we need to have a way to be able to access that information as it's represented as a single layer here. So that's where this view mode comes into play. We just click this dropdown. I know I want to go to the height channel, so I want to view basically the blending modes for the height channel that are contained within this layer. Like the way I think of it is like the layer's like a box. Inside the box, there's several channels, and I'm basically opening the box, grabbing out the height channel, going to do something with it. And so what that is we're going to come over here to our blending mode, and if I click this drop down, you can see there's all these blending modes, and I'm just going to set it to normal. And normal is basically like this normal blending mode, meaning no blending. So think of it that way. I think it'd be nice if it just said no blending, but normal is no blending. Okay, so you'll see that as soon as I do that, we pretty much fix the issue where the logo itself, anywhere it was black, we now are overwriting that height information underneath of it. And the height information that we're using to overwrite in this layer, just so you know, just to be super clear, it's coming from this height information here. So for example, if I set this to say 0 or close to 0, it would almost, because it's 0 height, it's like cutting out the logo. And that could be a cool effect too. Like for example, if I grab my move tool and move this in, there you go. That could be kind of interesting as well. Not what I'm looking to do in this case, but like I said, lots of different things you can do in Painter. Let's take this height slider back. Okay, so now that we have this in place, here's an issue that I don't like. So within the logo, because the logo is black and white, designed mainly to be used with a mask, even though I'm not using it as a mask in this case, you can see that the white area is kind of still showing through to the circles underneath. And I'd like for the circles that are contained or showing up within the logo itself to not be visible. So a really quick way of fixing that would be to, well, paint it out. But we have the issue where this fill layer, this is a paint layer. Now I could create a paint layer on top of it, set to height, and I could go in with my brush and we could start to try to paint this out if we were to set, again, so you can see lots of clicks I'm doing here, right? So I'd have to go to this layer, change the blending mode to normal, and now I could go in and paint, but oh, look at this. It's now overriding, because this layer's on top, it's overriding the logo. And I could try to be really careful and mask. So like I said, lots of issues, right? What I'm gonna do is show you a new way of working with fill layers, and that is to add an effect to the layer. So we have our fill layer. Like I said, we can't paint on it, but we can come over here to this button, this magic wand, which is add effect. And what you can do, if I just kind of zoom in on this, you can see we'll come over here to add effect. And here, this drop down, we can add things like generators, which we're not actually covering in this class. Those are like filters, in case you're wondering. There's also filters, but generators help you produce specific effects, like if you were to put like, let's say, edge wearing on metal or something like that. But what we're going to focus on is adding this paint effect here. And so when I do that, it looks like I've added 2 of them. Let's just kill it. So you can see here in my logo, or my layer for logo, we have the fill layer, and then we have this paint effect that's added to it. What's kind of cool is I could name this. So if I wanted to be, really organized about how I'm setting my layers, I could say, this is going to remove circles. So I kind of know what it's doing. It also has its own blending mode and layer opacity. So imagine you'll be able to stack this to create even more complex effects. But here's what we're going to do with this. So we have the remove circles. I could paint across multiple channels. Instead, I'm just going to use height, and I'm going to set this here to a value of 0. And now I have my brush, and I'm going to scale my brush up. It's a soft brush. So one thing I could do, hold down Command or my Alt key and move my mouse button. So I've got my right mouse button clicked and I'm moving my mouse up, and that's just the keyboard shortcut we covered earlier to give the brush a hard edge. I could also jump over here to this alpha and set the hardness here if I want to. Okay, so now we have this set up. I can go in and paint. And notice that I'm able to paint these circles out and just overriding the height information of 0 to overwrite the layers below it, which is affecting the circles. This is great, awesome. And because I'm doing this on the logo layer itself with this paint effect, I don't have to worry about overwriting the height data for the logo. And so that's a really quick way to get the look that I want here without having to add multiple layers and do a bunch of, jumping through hoops and stuff like that. Okay, awesome. So that's all set up and good to go. Now, another thing that we can do while I'm looking at this is it looks pretty good, but I feel like the edges are a little too sharp. And, what I could have done, I guess, inside of the logo file was maybe, soften the edges a little bit. But, I didn't do that. But, hey, I'm in Painter. I can do that here. So let's come over here to the layer, select it again. I'm going to jump over to my add effect, and this time I'm going to add a filter. And this is like adding filter to something, say, like Photoshop. So I can add a filter here, and there's all kinds of filters like bevels and blurs and things like that. What I'm going to do is add a blur effect, and you can see that this is blurring. Going to apply the blur to all of the channels. Now, because this particular layer only has height information, it's only affecting height, so I don't need to do anything, but just for clarity's sake, I like to just make sure that height is enabled. All right, so now I'm kind of blurring this. It's too much, so I'm just going to increase or decrease the intensity. So here's what it looks like without the blur, and we get this little aliased edge. But what I'm going to do is just increase it slightly, and now we've got a nice kind of smooth, nice blur here. However, I think it might be just a little too much. So what I can do now is add another effect. This time I'm going to add a levels effect. Another way to kind of look at these effects is like if you're adding an adjustment layer inside of Photoshop. So now we have a levels, and the levels is saying, hey, I'm going to do a levels adjustment, but on what channel do you want me to operate on inside this layer? Well, in my case, I know this particular layer only has height information, so I'm going to choose the height information. And now I have a histogram that I can work with. So let's take this input white and just move it a little bit towards the black just to kind of sharpen up that bevel or that blur that we're doing. And so now what I get is this nice looking kind of blurred logo effect. This is precisely what I was looking to do. So here's what it looks like without the blur in the levels. Okay, you can see it's a little weak, the edging, I don't like it, but now I've just kind of, made that a little bit better by just adding a few effects that I can add to this logo layer here for the fill. And that is going to take care of this particular effect. All good to go. Now, one other thing that I forgot to do is I flip around to the back here. You'll notice, whoa, look at this, goes all the way through to the inside. Maybe that's okay in this particular case. Of the phone case, we'll say. But just to show you, if I wanted to fix this, what I could do is just come over here to the properties fill. And as you've seen already, we could change this projection depth slider. We'll just adjust this until that logo just kind of disappears. There we go. And if we flip around to the back again, just make sure, yep, it's still there, all good. And that projection depth was here to save the day once again. And now we have come to the end. We have our asset fully textured. And this is the final result that we have. Okay, so I'm going to quickly come over here and make sure I save this scene. And the next thing we want to talk about is how we can export this material or the textures, how we export this data, how we get out of Substance Painter so we can use it in another application. But before we jump right into the export, I do want to take a little bit of a dive over into talking about resolution. I hinted at this at the very beginning of the video. So up here where we have our texture set list, which this is our materials as I discussed, we have our cover and our case, and then there is some resolution settings here right next to it. And so at the start of this project, I started off using a resolution of 2048 by 2048. So we're going to take a look at how we can change this. So let's look at the case. I'm going to zoom in and we can look at the data or the texture detail that we've been creating, right? So let's come over here to the case. If I click this little resolution button, you can see it gives me a drop down and I have a bunch of different options. Let's do something crazy like 256 by 256. So I'm going to change my resolution and you can see that this looks horrendous. Substance Painter has taken the 2K textural detail that we created, that we've been authoring, and we've just thrown it all out, and now we're at this 256 by 256. So what I'm showcasing here is that with Substance Painter, you can move up and down the resolution stack. So it's resolution independent. And so now that we've thrown away this data, typically you wouldn't be able to get this back. So like if you were in, say, Photoshop and you did like an image resize, you're not going to be able to scale it back up, right? So here we have no data. This looks terrible. But if I were to switch this back to 2048 by 2048, I can just get all my resolution right back. So I can move from somewhere as terrible as 128 by 128 and go all the way to 2048 by 2048, which is pretty cool. Let's take a look at another example. If I zoom in really close at this 2K, I can see that, well, it looks okay, but the circles, there's not enough. These circles, this is a small detail. And in this texture space, the UV coordinates, this is something referred to as texel density. You can see that there's not enough texel density here to give me this really nice sharp circle. It looks okay from far away, but if I want to do a nice close-up shot, this isn't going to cut it. However, I have Substance Painter, so I can change the resolution. Let's bump this up to 4096 now, so 4K. And you'll notice that we are now going to increase our resolution. So we'll go to 4K. Substance Painter has now computed that, and you can see that we get an even more crisp result. Now, it isn't perfect, of course. The more and more you zoom in, just because we're working with a rasterized image here, of course we're going to lose information, but you can see that I can now work at 4K. And at this angle, say if this is going to be my shot, this is going to look great. And like I said, we can work at 2048 and have this level resolution. So I'm going to have my viewport as I'm working. Everything's going to be snappy. That's the way you want to work. And then I know that, okay, once all the work is done, I could upscale this to 4096. And I say upscale. It's not like just a res up, right? Substance Painter is actually redrawing this information. Just to give you an idea, if I come over here to this history button, Substance Painter keeps a history of everything that I've been doing. So I can move through this history stack, but Substance Painter can use that to basically redraw my image at the correct resolution. So I'm actually getting a true 4K image. And when you import a bitmap, so something that's locked, like a bitmap, that is maybe at a low resolution, like 120, like we'll say 1K by 1024 by 1024 or 1K, and we scale that up, yeah, it is going to upscale that bitmap. That's why for the logo, you can see that I used that Illustrator file with that vector detail, or that vector data, I mean. And that's great because that is vector information. I can scale that, and Substance Painter's like, oh, you want to go to 4K? No problem. Mathematically under the hood, it's using the vector data before that final output of this rasterized kind of bitmap. That's why the logo itself looks fantastic, even at this 4K resolution when I zoom in on it. Whereas the circles, which are a base resolution, I believe it's probably 2K, that's the circles here that we used, you can see that while it does improve under 4K, it's not perfect. So again, just food for thought in the sense of like if you want to have something like a logo that you need to scale up and down, use different resolutions, using an Illustrator vector graphic is a good way to go. All right, so let's talk about that export. So like I said, usually I keep this all at 2K. It just depends on your system. Like I said, Substance Painter's GPU bounds. If you have a beefy GPU, yeah, maybe you can work at 4K. Usually I'm just used to 2K, and then I upscale when I need to. It is kind of nice. It just as another tip that as you're working every now and then, if you know you're going to export at 4K, bump it to 4K and just check and see, because sometimes you'll notice here that at 2K, this bevel, the blur looks a little bit softer, but it's a little bit sharper under 4K. So, just so you don't get any surprises every now and then, just check at what resolution you want to work at. Okay, so let's talk about that export. So I want to export out a series of textures, or we'll say a material. So what I do is I come over here to File, and I choose Export Textures, and that's going to give me this new dialog window, and here I have this Settings tab. Now over here on the left, I can see the two materials that I've been working with, and those are the materials that are here in the texture set list. If I want to, I could say, hey, you know what? I only want to export just the case, so I can uncheck Cover and export just the case. But here, of course, I want to do both. Now, once we have both here, we want to set an output directory, so you would just choose where, where on your computer you want to save the file. So now we have this section here for output template. And if I click this drop down, there's all these different options for different workflows and different renderers that you would support or that you would be exporting for. Now, in my case, what I like to use most often is I'm just going to choose this document channels plus normal plus AO, meaning ambient occlusion, no alpha. And so let's take a moment here to discuss what is this document channels. So when we first set up our project, we used the template, and that's what these document channels are. You can see that over here in the texture set settings. So let me just close this window. If we come over, now we didn't talk much about these texture set settings, but what this is think of it like our texture set list where we have our two materials. This is where we set up the overall kind of settings. This is where the channels live, everything for these materials or texture sets. So if we look under the general properties, you can see that we have these channels. And like I said, when we first created our project, we chose a template, and that template had these specific channels: base color, height, rough, metal, normal, that we were going to be working with here. So if I choose to export using the template document channels, it's going to export the channels that I have listed here. Now, one thing you can do in Substance Painter is you can just add channels as you need them. So for example, if I wanted to create, or if I was working on a texture or a material that was going to be more complex, like for example, if I come over and click this plus button here, let me just expand this window a little bit, and then we'll click this plus button. You can see that I have lots of different custom channels. For example, if I was doing something with like clear coating or scattering or translucency, I can work with these more advanced channels. Now in this course, we didn't cover that, but just wanted you to know that that capability is there, and that is what we're talking about with our document channels. So again, going back to our export textures. So now taking a look at the file type, if I click this drop down, there's all kinds of options, different file formats like PNG, Target, TIFF, and so on. However, if I scroll down towards the bottom, there's this SBSAR format. This is what I'm going to use. So SBSAR stands for Substance Archive, and it's essentially what we call a substance material. With all the textures we've been authoring, it's going to pack them into this one file. This is super convenient because you have one file, all the texture information is embedded in this one file, and any major 3D application that already supports the Substance plugin can easily read this information. So you're not having to jump into a shader and manually hook up texture maps. You can just let the Substance plugin do all the heavy lifting. So we're going to use this SBS AR. Then we have our bit depth. We'll just leave this at default. And then we have our size here. So it's based on the texture set size. And if we take a look over here, you can see that in my texture set list, I've already switched this to 4K, but as we discussed earlier in the video, we can just click this and choose a different dropdown. So if I have this set at 4K, then using this option based on texture set size, it's just going to export the SBS AR with a 4K texture. However, if I were to have kept this resolution at a lower value, such as like 2K, what I could do is I could come over here at export time and then choose 4K or even 8K at this point. So one way that I like to work is, just like I said, I keep things at just 2K, keeps my viewport snappy, and I jump over to my resolution here in the texture set settings, just check it every now and then, make sure everything is good, and then on my export, I might just switch that to 4K. So again, options, you can use whatever works best for you. So in this case, I'm just going to set it to the based on each texture size, and I have it set here in the texture set list. Now, you also have this other option here for padding. Just leave this at default. What this is doing is adding a little bit of dilation. This is really good if your textures are being processed by something like a game engine where they're probably going to get mip-mapped, which just means as they are scaled down, there's going to be basically some bleed outside of the UV shells. So again, as these textures are scaled down, you're not going to get like a black line around where the UV shells are. It's advanced topic, so again, just leave the padding here at this default setting. It's going to be good for all kinds of situations, and it's one of those we can set it and forget it kind of things. Okay, so with everything set up, I can just click export, and Substance Painter is now going to export all the textures, compile it to the Substance archive file, and then I'll have my Substance material file, that SBSAR, that I can then use in my 3D program. So here I'm in Blender, and you can see I've exported the hard case and the cover, and it's a Substance material, and it's just been applied. And like I said, the beauty of using this method is that the Substance add-on, the Substance 3D panel here, it creates the shader network for me. So it's literally just kind of like import and apply, and I'm good to go. So here's the same scene with the Substance materials loaded into Cinema 4D, and I'm rendering here in Redshift. And here we have our scene and our materials applied here in Maya, rendering with Arnold. And that's going to close out this tutorial. I hope you enjoyed your first steps with Substance Painter, and there's just so much more to learn. I hope you enjoyed this video and learned a lot, and I encourage you to continue your journey starting your own projects. Thanks a lot for watching, and I'll see you next time.